Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son business podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems like controlling your dogs that are big, and they can be big problems. So, hey, Waldo, good to see you, man. How you doing today?
Good, Otis. You too. Thanks a lot for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, everybody's going to say, as I introduce you, Waldo, what kind of name is Waldo? Where's Waldo, all that. And I know enough about pilots, plane drivers, aviators, jockeys, you call them whatever you will. I've got some other not so nice names that I used to use, depending on the situation. But when you have a nickname like Waldo, there's got to be a story, and I'm guessing it has something to do with navigation. I don't know. What's the story? How did you
Well,
get Waldo as your nickname?
you would think that you're right, and I'm pretty fortunate. It has nothing to do with navigation. Unlike a friend of mine who ended up with the call sign Marco after Marco Polo, the Great White Navigator, who got himself lost. So picture this is back late '90s. I think maybe Waldo was a little more popular then. And as you probably know, most units, and I know when you served those, your units usually have a unit color, like your, that goes with your crests or whatever. And the training squadron when I was learning to fly fighters, their colors were red and gold. So you wore a red turtleneck or a red T-shirt under your flight suit. And I generally wear glasses, which I don't have on. But when I fly, I wear contacts. So it was Friday night, had my contacts in, finished flying, and everybody was going to the officers club after to celebrate the week as you generally do in the military tradition. And I said, well, I'm going to skip home and get my glasses on, and I'll meet you guys at the club. Well, 90s, if you can imagine, glasses were a little rounder, not, little style. And the hairline was a little dark, a little lower, and was a little darker, a little more filled in back then. And let's just say by the time I got to the club, some of my friends had already had a couple. And as in the bars in the basement. So as I'm coming down the stairs, one of my buddies bursts through the door to go to the men's room. And he walks out and he looks up. And there I am in a red turtleneck, the rounder glasses, walking down the stairs. And he's like, oh, my God, it's Waldo. And that was it. And normally you get a call sign review board. I don't know what it's like in some services, but in the Canadian military, normally before they change your call sign, you get a call sign review board, and there's a court and the whole bit, and a judge and a jury. No, not in my case. I showed up squadron Monday morning. My name tags were all changed on the schedule to the point where I didn't know I was flying because I didn't. There was one instance. It was in a passing. I went into the bar, never heard about it again for the rest of the night. And then when I showed up, I couldn't find myself on the scheduling board on Monday. And then everybody's like, "Where's Waldo? Let's go flying." And we're all like, "Who the heck is Waldo?" I guess that was me, and it has stuck ever since. So
I love that's awesome.
So that's where it comes from.
It is the true natural you. That's how you know it's a really good call sign is when it's naturally happens like that. That's awesome.
So there are worse ones to have, trust me.
Oh, believe me. One of my best friends was a C-130 navigator, and his nickname was Plugger, as in the old GPS thing. Yeah. So
there you have.
Yeah. So all that time flying, how does that the time in that seat at 500 miles an hour set you up for what you're doing today? What's that like core lesson that you've gained that's enabled you to leap forward and be successful?
I think one thing flying really taught me a couple major lessons. The first one is you can't do anything alone. Right? The fighter pilot community is all about teamwork and having a wingman. I'm sure everybody's watched Top Gun. Never leave your wingman. Well, you never leave your wingman. So that just does not happen. And you can't. The minimum fighting element is two, right? And I'm sure with your background that you had rules of engagement or standard operating procedures and how you would progress and do your business. And if you were below your minimum fighting element, you were improvising big time. or you were running home to safety at that point, in all honesty, to save yourself. So that was probably the very first lesson that, flying, although if you're in a single seat airplane may seem like a one man or one woman endeavor, it is not. It's a full team sport, and that's your formation, not to mention the extended team that's required to make it function like that. It is not just the people in the airplane, the one or two people. You're talking on radios. You've got controllers helping guide you. You've had all the guys who've done the maintenance on the airplanes, for the weapon systems, everything. It's a huge team sport. So if anything you learn from flying, although a lot of people think fighter pilots are, crazy egomaniacs, them and their jet, and that's it. It couldn't be further from the truth. And then I would say the second thing,
if you're that guy, right? I mean, all that stuff they show with Tom Cruise and Top Gun and the flybys and all that. You don't get back behind that stick.
I missed the first part, Otis. Say that again.
Well, you don't get behind that stick if you're doing all that cowboy stuff and, blowing the rules and, what's the deck going below the deck or the seal, all those rules that are set up for safety. You violate those, you ain't flying.
You're not flying. No, we had a pretty good culture in our military, and I think they call it just culture in the sort of the flight safety vernacular, but I think what you're referring to is those instances where you flagrantly kind of go break the rules. Mm-hmm. And there's generally, I don't even know if I can count maybe one or two fingers of incidents I remember or recall where people did that. People are just professional, mm-hmm. right? They're there to do a mission. They're serving their country and they do that. But things happen. And what I loved about my military, and I think it's similar here. I was in the Canadian military, so what I think it's very similar here in the U.S. forces is there's this construct of just culture where the assumption is nobody's going out to break the rules, that if something happens, it's for a reason that is usually out of the control, or you made a choice or a decision for safety reasons, but it ended up causing you to break some sort of rule. And then you look into it and you investigate and you learn. That's the whole point of it, is to learn from it and get better, and not to point a finger and blame and get people in trouble, because nobody goes out deliberately to do something wrong. I mean, it's very, very, very rare instances. So,
talking about that team environment. Talk about that culture and that team environment. What was it like adjusting out of it? Because I can imagine, Dad, we've talked about, your experience with the Green Berets being in the team room. And then you get out and it's like, okay, I had these, all these high performance guys all working in this area, all supporting each other, all understanding the mission, all understanding the culture. Everyone's working towards completing this mission. Get out into the civilian world and not everyone's pushing the same direction always, all those type of things. So what was your experience like making that transition, Waldo?
Yeah, I noticed two things in particular, Cam. One was sort of a planning mentality of the planning for the what ifs. So on the front end of doing the work and the mission, like most people, even whether military or private sector, know how to do their jobs and are very successful at it. But I think in today's day and age, we've talked a lot about resiliency with the pandemic and things that have gone on with that. And I think one of the things I've observed having retired was a lot of people they'll take the time to, the event that's coming up, let's get everything done and right. We've got a plan in place, but then they don't sit down and go, well, what if, right? To walk you through the things that could go wrong so that you're prepared to have a backup plan, or you can pivot, and then it looks seamless to the people you're working with or the people you're supporting, which is the goal, right? You want to execute it to 100%. And I found that some organizations don't do it at all, and some do it a little bit, not as effectively, I don't think, as we did it in the service. And then I think similarly on the back end is the debrief, where a lot of organizations don't take time to sit down and go, okay, even if something went very well, there's still stuff to learn. You can always learn and be better. And I think what happens is, and Otis, I don't know I'm sure it was the same for you. In the military, my job as a leader was to train my people to do my job, mm-hmm. right? Like that's what, train them to be leaders, right? Make them better and so you are redundant. That is the whole name of the game. Well, that is not the name of the game in the private sector, right? Because that can kind of have career implications, and people can lose their jobs, and I think people are very protective of their jobs, and I find that's a bit of a cultural difference between the two worlds. And I really found that that when you're not worried about that, you have, especially on the back end, where you can really develop your team with that debrief construct and sit down and go, hey, it went great, but what could we have done better? And then there's no blame game in a debrief in the military, right? In the Air Force, we use call signs. When you get a debrief, you don't call anybody by their first name. You call them by the call sign of the flight, right? The name and rank are left outside in the hallway. Like I have been, I've been a commanding officer, and I have been number 4 in a formation with a young captain leading, and I'm a lieutenant colonel. And we sat down in the debrief, and I had a bad flight, and he chewed me a new one because I messed up and caused issues on the mission, right? And there were things to learn. And I, first of all, I put your hand up and you go, yeah, this is what I did wrong, and I could have done better. But it's his job to drag that out of you in the debrief. And there's no rank in the mission debrief. And once you walk out, though, you're the commanding officer. He's the captain. You have your jobs to do. But in that mission debrief, he's the boss. And that's the way we ran business. And I think that's is a couple of big lessons I learned, Cam, that are culturally different between my time in the service and then my time in the private sector.
I've noticed the same thing, and I've got a couple of clients that I'm always poking them, and they're like, yeah, we're going to do an after action. We're going to do it. And it's like, hey, Rick, if you're listening to this show, I'm talking about you. I'm calling you out right now, buddy. But poking and poking and poking, because we need to do that. What I'd love to get your opinion on is the balance, not with the AAR stuff, because that's pretty simple, right? We need to take a pause, reflect back. But it's the what if, because God damn, we were good at that in the Army and the military, and I was at some pretty high levels in the staff and the planning, and whoo, man, we kept ourselves employed with what if and things. Let's just say writing more plans. What's your opinion for a business in that balance? Because like I said, I made my last 5 years before I retired. I was basically a professional what ifer, and then writing the plan to take care of the what if. That's unrealistic in business. What's the setup that you can help guys do?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the point with the military too, though, and I'm glad you were a career whatever, because in all honesty, people's lives were on the line of work you were doing, right? So depending on the work you do, even in the private sector, that could be the case. And then I would hope organizations would be doing what you were doing. But I think you're right, the balance. And so what I would do and talk to my team was I would ask them, so what do you see? I would, if they're briefing me on a major event, for example, I go, what do you see as the major risks? Like, what are the risks? The probability and impact of something happened. And we would talk through, and they would maybe list a half a dozen of them. And I go, okay, which ones do you think are really going to could potentially play out, or which ones have the highest impact, right? And then so get them focused down on just a couple to what if. I mean, because I think that's to your point, you could what if this to death, but you just focus on some of the major risks, and it maybe impacts to the event or the operation or whatever it is you're working on. The project. And that, if you do that, I think that at least it creates a mindset and just going through it creates an exercise, so that when you're doing deliberate planning like that, it's then much easier to be reactive in the moment, right? Because you've gone through the process multiple times, and you're learning, and you're exercising that muscle, that when you actually have to do it for real, even if it's not something that you've actually planned out that scenario specifically, you can still do a much better job reacting than if you hadn't done it. So that's how I work with my teams is we pick the top couple risks, and we kind of what if those just to make sure.
I think the what ifs are really important, and what comes to mind is like how the more you can build out that formula, that flow chart, if you want to put it that way, of like all these different decisions, mapping out those decisions, the better you can react in real time. And this might be a little bit of a naive question, but just from my very basic understanding of what goes into being a pilot, and history, I guess history broadly of being a pilot, the advances in planes and those type of things. how formulaic is the approach of actually flying, of, the way you handle different procedures and things? Because when you see somebody flying, it's like, oh my gosh, free as a bird. But from everything I've understood, it's way more like, no, you do this thing exactly. We're all doing this exactly together. And that's what makes you so successful. Is that a right understanding, or could you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cam. So we had a lot of standard operating procedures. So the stuff that you didn't have to brief, that you trained on a lot. So going back to not necessarily the what ifing, because that was sort of stuff you were doing. And some of the what ifs were pretty standard. Like, for example, I led, so you have Red Flag at Nellis Air Force Base, huge multinational, combined air operations with allies and, Army, Navy, Air Force all working together. And we had the same thing up in Canada, which was Exercise Maple Flag up in Cold Lake. Mm-hmm. And so I was a package commander one day for that. And so you're leading 70 fighters. You have your own formation you're leading of 4 jets, maybe 8. Plus you're in charge of all 70 airplanes. Plus that's not including the tankers, the AWACS, the ground support that's there, the controllers. So you've got to, the night before you and while you're planning that, like, you are what ifing that thing to death. As far as fall, and the big one usually is weather and fallouts. Like, so if somebody doesn't show up, so each formation, and this is just like a team at an organization, right? So you've got different formations have different skills. So some guys are flying close air support for ground troops. Some folks are doing ground attack. Some folks are doing air defense, and some of them are sweeping, which means they're going in ahead air to air for the air to ground package to clear the airspace, where you've got air defenders, other ones that are just defending the high value assets like the tankers and the AWACS back behind you. So everybody's got very unique missions. And if certain people fall out, it's the package commander has to make the decision on who's going to flex and go and do what. So for example, if one of your sweep formations completely fell out, let's say you're flying from different bases, and this can all translate to business too. So if they're flying from a different base and they're your sweep, well, if they fall out, you have nobody to sweep the airspace in front of you. So are you going to then reassign a different formation that was carrying bombs, or somebody who was protecting a high value asset to do that? You've got to do all that mental math on the fly and figure out who needs to do what, where, and make it all happen. And back to your question, it's not scripted, but the process is kind of scripted. So we always know that we need to have a backup plan for every mission. Every key aspect of the mission has to have a backup plan. So we already know that. So to your point, I think that answers kind of your question. So yeah, it may look like we're footloose and fancy free up there, but yeah, we're following a pretty defined, very defined plan. But it doesn't mean we can't flex from the plan based on the situation. So big clouds show up, weather, fire. Like, we have forest fires all the time in northern Canada. But when they're doing actual real world firefighting with water bombers, they block off that chunk of airspace. So sometimes we've had to flex targets, like, and change our targets when we're training, obviously. So we've had to change our targets so we can get the training value of it, because airplanes have already taken off and we don't want to burn all that gas for nothing. So we flex in the air and figure something out. But yeah, there's a process for doing it all. That's what underlies what looks like a very flexible organization. And I think to your point is, if organizations have good documented procedures, they're a lot more agile, I think, because everybody knows how you're supposed to work together and then can work together when you got to flex.
Yeah, I think it's interesting on the individual level, and then how that scales out to the team. Because honestly, what inspired that question was, I don't know if this was something I was reading or something I watched, but they were talking about pilots in World War II, and the Japanese planes were faster, and so they were running into all these problems. And then the thing that blew my mind about it was that there was, I don't remember his name, but there was a U.S. pilot who was out there. He's like, oh, if we just go this direction instead of this direction, it completely changes what they do, and it created this little tiny thing. And to your point, though, it's these individual movements. It's like, it's almost like, I keep going back to rugby, of course, because, we always talk rugby, Dad. But it's like you have all these individual things that matter so much, but then you have to look at the entire field at the same time. How did you find a way to help to translate that into the civilian world? Again, of just having that like broad scope of things so you can understand when to be flexible inside your own job versus when to go call the boss and all those little nuances.
Yeah, when you talked about the Japanese pilot things and the U.S. pilots flexing, it reminds me, and kind of the translation is, so when you look at an aircraft and a pilot combination together, no two planes and no two pilots, when you put them together, will you get the same capability,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's kind of like looking at your team as well, and like what are the skill sets that each person has? What team are they operating? Smaller team potentially that they operating within? So again, you take that back to the team construct too. And we would be very particular about which aircrew we would pair together in formations, depending on whether we were training or whether we were in
Mm-hmm.
actual combat, like we did over Kosovo, for example, when the last time I flew in combat. So very, very particular who you match up with who to create a real symbiotic relationship, so that the individual is acting as, the four individuals in a four ship formation are acting actually as a whole, right?
Right.
And being effective. So, so for example, but an airplane, particularly like an F-15 or an F-16 or an F-18, each one actually fights differently, has a different specialization than, say, an air-to-air dogfight. So an F-18, low and slow. If I can get a fighter slow, I was a happy camper, because that airplane was phenomenal. Slow speed. High speed, F-15 would just thump us every day, right? If we couldn't get into a high speed fight. And F-16 was just a kind of a generic, very good across the board. But each airplane, believe it or not, like when you look at an airplane turning like in a dogfight, like I'll give you the Top Gun reference when they're doing the dogfight air to air, each airplane has its own specific speed that it turns, its fastest turn rate. So they don't all turn at the same. So it's a number of degrees per second, not your actual airspeed, that matters in a dogfight. It's how fast I can turn my nose and track my nose and get around a circle faster than you can, because that's where I can get my nose on you quicker. So if you're turning at 22 degrees a second and I can turn at only 15 degrees a second, well, you're going to outrate me, right? And if you're behind me, that's not good for me. And if you're in front of me, then you're going to get away from me. So you look at those individual airplane, and it's like individual people in an organization. Mm-hmm. They're all unique and have specific skills and specific environments where they work best. And I really noticed that when we went from in-person to remote with COVID. Mm-hmm. And I was actually shocked by the change in, I won't say people's performance specifically. I mean, they got their jobs done, but I could tell it was not as, it was a little more arduous on some folks than others. So just that change of environment, being away from people. So I really, as a leader, had to flex how I interacted with folks and how often I touched base with them, and creating opportunities for them to be engaged with the team if that's the kind of person they were. Yeah. So that's, I think, translates kind of to your, I hope that answers the question you're asking. But yeah, everybody is unique, and you as a leader, you have got to not paint a broad brush across your team. It will not work well. Long answer, right, short question.
No. I'm loving it, because I'm sitting there thinking, all right, now it's time for, I'll be using my turning rate as a description for people for their next couple of weeks, because I love that. Oh, so you're a 22 degree per second.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I know where you're at. That's awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of smart ass Otis comments that I can feel coming.
Yeah, I'll come in there. If I can give you any more ammunition, you let me know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm always taking more bullets. Remember, I was a Green Beret. We always took more bullets. You want me to carry more? Okay, I got more bullets. As long as there's more bullets, I'll carry them.
Never have enough. That's one thing flying a fighter, man. Once you're off the ground, you're well, we could get gas in the air. That was at least one thing, but you weren't getting any more ammunition.
No, we haven't figured out how to put more bullets or missiles on that airplane while it's flying, have we?
I haven't figured out how to do air-to-air ammunition reloading. No, they haven't figured that concept out yet, but
there we go. There's our business. Starting right here in Colorado Springs, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Speaking of starting businesses, how did you make that decision to leap out? Because you did kind of the standard military thing, military career, go into the defense industry, big corporation, a management program manager sort of role in that where it's, comfortable. But then you made a shift and went out on your own. What was the catalyst to do that?
Well, I got to admit the retirement catalyst, that was kind of a lifer. I left a few years early. To say there wasn't a woman involved would be a lie. So I met my wife down here in Colorado Springs. So that I turned down that promotion back to run the operations center in Canada, and I said, no, I think I'm going to stay. I think there's better things for me ahead down here. So yeah, I think that you're right. The transition was not easy, and I think there was one role I had in between going and work for the defense contractor, my first job post retirement. And that's always the scary one, right? I think for everybody, I got to admit, looking back, that's all I remember is working on my resume for months and months before I retired. And my wife, and pardon the expression, my wife finally said, "How long are you going to polish that turd?" She's like, "You need to call people, like start calling people, like." And if there's nothing I've learned in the private sector about jobs, and it's all about relationships, right? So I ended up with this about a year and a half long interim job, again through a military contact guy I worked with during we were deployed in the Middle East together, and he was here in Colorado Springs, and so he's connected to everybody. So he's my first phone call, and it turned into a job. And so I worked with in the organization he was at for about a year and a half. But I think the transition to obviously getting back to the defense sector was kind of easy, right? Like wanting to do that and that kind of work was fun and enjoyable, and being back with sort of similar people. Interestingly enough, that organization did not have a lot of ex-military people in it, believe it or not. So it was right here in the Springs, but I got to work with all the defense contractors, the major, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Grummans, and do programs for them. So I really, really enjoyed the work I was doing. I think for me though, I did that for 2.5 years, and I think one thing I was learning, that I loved the people I worked with, incredibly hardworking. We were doing great work. As a program manager for a new ejection seat. So I mean, you're saving lives. Like how cool is that, right? After having sat in them for 3,500 hours. But I think I had some personal struggles with the profitability construct within the big Fortune 50 aerospace company. And everything was about dollars, and it wasn't about people. And that, I think, just wore me down. And every day I got to look at myself in the mirror and shave, and you got to be true to yourself at all times. And I got to a point where I couldn't stomach it anymore. I just was not feeling comfortable. Like, I mean, we weren't cutting corners on safety with respect to the product or anything like that financially. It was not about that, but it was about not being completely honest. I mean, as they say, you don't have to be transparent, but you should at least be translucent. Maybe with your customer, right? You still got some certain business, you got to protect the business you work for. They pay you every day, right? They're the ones that you have your loyalty to. But there's certain things that where, in knowing I was on that other side, like I was going to be, I used to be the person who was the user of the product, right? That I was building or having my team build, the organization was building. And so it was very personal for me, I think was one reason. And so I just have this service bug in my, that gene in my body, and it wasn't, that profitability aspect just wasn't working for me very well. It was the way we were structuring and the way we were running the program, from guidance from leadership telling me how to run the program, just didn't sit well. So I looked for something new, and I got very fortunate, and I found a job at one of the oldest family foundations in the state of Colorado, and got very, very lucky and made a move to that, and spent 4 amazing years there. So just left there last fall, just because it was just time for me to go. So kind of went in and did the things I needed to do, and help that organization out. And actually now I took some time off, and I'm just kind of looking for my next best thing. I went back to school about 1.5 years ago. So it's kind of where I'm at.
Good for you. Tell us about that, because that's a really interesting thing. The audience knows that I do a lot of work with soon-to-be veterans. But I think there's a really interesting piece in the seasons of life sort of thing. The seasons of life in your military service, the seasons of life in that first job, probably not a real season, probably just a storm. And then going with Boettcher, Boettcher.
Boettcher.
Boettcher. See, I couldn't.
Yeah.
Boettcher. Yeah. I didn't do the Camden thing and ask you how to say it before we started.
No worries. You weren't the first one, Otis.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I bet. But you did, and you surmised it really good right there. I thought that was really, really good, and I think a lot of people feel that, but don't take action in that sense, right? Because you feel a completion, and some people hold on to that comfort. You stepped into discomfort and even went back to school. I say that snidely, but I know I'm all jest and intended there, because it is an important thing. So what's that mind shift, that mindset like? Because that's a big step to go from comfort, both in a career, in a role, in an identity, and money in the bank account also, oh, by the way, and then stepping out of that into basically an unknown, create something.
Yeah, that's a great. You made me think about that sort of phases of your life, and you kind of said the military thing, and then the private sector thing, and then there was a little discomfort and the change in there. And I think upon reflection, now that I've heard you sort of talk about that, I think, and I've thought of this before, and I think if we think of our careers, maybe it's not so much as in where we're working or the type of organization we're in, but in how we've developed from a personal perspective. So when I do a little reflection, and caused me to do a little deeper reflection here with that question, I kind of look at the first years of my life and career professionally as those are where you're developing the skills to be the best you could be at what people are paying you to do, right? I was my first kind of in thirds, right? My first third was be the best pilot I can be, and very different in the Air Force than what you would have went through, Otis. Like, I mean, when you were a young lieutenant, like, dude, you were given people to take care of, right? Like you had, it was like sink or swim, dude, right? But you had some really great senior NCOs to help you out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
As a young, I was a flying instructor for my first tour, so I was leading mostly me. But then, you get a student in the cockpit, right? And you're obviously the leader in taking care of them and doing that. So it was a much more one-on-one thing. So very different leadership style required, I think, in doing that. But my job was to be the best flying instructor I could be and just learn and grow and just develop who I was as an individual. And then I think the second third is where you've learned those basics, but then you kind of move on and you apply some broader skills. You get into Cam, you talked about planning earlier. You start talking about things like that, more organizational leadership, and you develop some skills in that space, and you become a contributor to the broader organization and mission as you grow and blossom, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think this last third, and that back to your comment with the transition there, Otis, I think why I felt I didn't feel the discomfort as much as I think maybe you portrayed, because I think what I did was I was bringing all those skills and the leadership that I had developed, and that's what I felt I was bringing to the team. I knew I wasn't coming in as a person who understood the foundation or nonprofit world or everything that went on there. That I had to accept that. You've got to learn to accept where you've got gaps in your skill sets and your knowledge, but you also need to understand what you bring to the table. And I will tell you, we as military vets do not give ourselves credit where credit is due in that space. We live in it, right? They say that expression, the fish doesn't know it's a fish till it's out of water, right? Mm-hmm. I think we live in that fishbowl as in the military, and we see leadership all day, every day, all around us, right? And I would say it is not as prolific in the private sector. I mean, good leadership is not as prolific.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, like, what stands out to you from, your military transition, your experience in the civilian world, contrasting this too, like you were just saying, what stands out as like the leadership attribute that you see as missing most often, or that people should work on more, or however you want to think about it?
Great question. When I get the answer, I will let you know. One of the things.
Come on, Waldo. We're not solving leadership today. I thought we were going to solve all the leadership problems in the world.
Yeah, I know. No, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. I probably have learned. This is the reason I went back to school. So when I went back to school, I'm taking a organizational leadership degree, and I have probably learned more in this last year and a half than I probably learned in 30 years. And now I caveat that though. I'm learning more probably because I have 30 years of experience to bounce it off of. So I'm learning the theory in a lot of the deeper level knowledge about organizational behavior and leading people in the different leadership styles. Like we don't spend enough time on that in the military, I don't think. It's kind of learned by example. So if you get some bad leaders early in your career, that's not a good thing. But I think that's how our militaries were. We spend so much time on mission and learning skills and planning, like you talked about earlier, Otis, that I think we don't spend enough time teaching our leaders what good leadership can look like and the foundation of why this is good leadership. So the portable skill aspect of it that you can take and carry. And that's why I think I've learned so much in this program that because I have all that back experience to bounce all of the theory now off of, and I feel like now I'm absorbing it a lot more. Mm-hmm. And so you ask kind of what's lacking, Cam, and I think that the difference is on the private sector, I think a lot of people study, they get business degrees, and you get a few people that study leadership, and you get some leadership junkies out there, the people that are kind of really love it. They've read Stephen Covey really early in their life, or they get really into some of the good books. And there's great people to learn from. Don't get me wrong, but I think what I've realized. Here's one thing I've really realized is there's no magic answer to the question, because I think your leadership changes as you grow and learn. And what I know now and what I've applied since I left the service, I did not have those tools and tricks and knowledge and background. That wouldn't have been me as a young captain in the Air Force. I've really struggled to compare the two to answer your question. And I guess that's why I'm giving you a real roundabout answer, because leadership's a life journey to me. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're a leader at age 25. That's it. You're good. You've got everything you need to get yourself through life. It doesn't work that way. It's hard. It takes personal investment and time. And I think it's just a little bit different, and I don't know the difference. Like I said, the military, we didn't get as much of the at least in my service, as much as the background knowledge that. And again, leadership style is different. Like Otis, you worked with people directly, grew large groups of people from the early in your career. We didn't do that as Air Force pilots. Very different construct. So you can take me and compare me to a maintenance officer. Very different construct. Would have had similar experience maybe to you, because they're dealing with people all day. By the time I really truly dealt with people, I was a flight commander. I was a senior officer before I dealt with groups of people. So just really different learning development profiles. And so I think my journey is just a little, unique, maybe from what I come from. And I know I probably didn't answer your question.
No, I love that. And there's an interesting piece there. It just makes me think too, talking about like the growth as a leader, and that you never really have all the answers. And when you talk about like reading leadership books or going to school for it, it's really easy to, okay, well, tell me the answer, and then I'm going to go apply the answer out there. And it makes me think to the economist Frank Knight has this line in one of his books that he talks about, talking about just economics in general. And he's like, most of the evils of like economics, or what people would call the evils of economics, are people taking a theory that they don't know anything about and just going and applying it blindly to a policy. That there's like this huge disconnect there. And I think it's a similar thing with leadership. You get this like, hey, here's this rule of thumb. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then you get people out there like, okay, that's how you lead. And then they lead their entire life like that, or a huge chunk of their life like that. And they are creating all those bad outcomes that you're talking about, because they're trying to just, paint with broad strokes, like you said earlier. I think it's an interesting thing there. But how do you then, talking about going back to that analogy, the broad strokes versus finding the individuals there, in your experience, how can you try to systemize that? Because when you start talking about knowing individuals, that's all great. But when you have 1,000 people, it's a lot harder to know every single individual. Might want to get a little bit of a wider brush out at some point. What are your thoughts on that? How can you systemize that to a larger scale?
Yeah, I think what I've learned, and I think there is, actual theory on this of how many people can one individual actually effectively supervise and lead. There's the leadership.
It's like 15, isn't it?
Management.
I feel like I've heard that number. Yeah. I was saying it's like 15, isn't it? I feel like I've heard that. Yeah.
I think that's the max. Yeah. It's like I've heard anywhere from like 12 to that 15 number too. Yeah. And I think they say the sweet spot is about 7 or 8. I think that's management. So there's that construct, that difference between leadership and management too. But I think as you talked about, I think you empower people, right? Your direct reports. So you're not going to have 1,000 people reporting to you. Like, so if it's too many, find a way to narrow that down, and then develop those people, right? Give them authority, give them power, let them be leaders, train them to take your job. Right, that to me is what it's all about, and creating. And the biggest thing I think a leader has a responsibility for, to go back to your point, broader organizational construct, you have the responsibility for the culture. You have to drive the culture in an organization the way you want to see it play out, and it has to be authentic and come from you. And I think, and to do that, I think you got to ensure you've got a mission that everybody understands. And I think one of the things I've really learned in the military, we always had their military values, but we never really looked at it from again, I'm going to go back to this sort of academic perspective of why values are important in an organization. I mean, I think intuitively all know they are, but to learn the real true understanding of the why, and a lot of organizations don't have true values. Like, you go to a website and I guarantee you probably find only 20% of the websites you look at, you'll find an organization's values. Mm-hmm. But I think if you lead from that, you will have a completely different impact on a group of people in a team. And because people can know what they're standing for and why they're doing what they're doing. And it kind of goes back to why I left my, aerospace job in the private sector, because the leadership I was working for just didn't meet my value system.
I usually ask this question in the back what you learned going forward, but I want to flip it, because this is really interesting. I haven't thought about it in this way. You mentioned, organizational leadership and learning so much in that. What's something that you've learned in this academic sense that, if you could fly back, notice the pun there, fly back to squadron commander time, I would do that right there, that moment, that event, or whatever, differently because of this understanding that I have here?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I maybe would have changed. So you get I'll tell you a little story in a minute too after I answer this question, because you will laugh, I'm sure, and you go, I can't believe you did that. A couple of things. One is about change management. There's serious science behind change management now, and it's something I was never taught or learned. And if we know anything in the military, Otis, things change constantly. And it changes constant everywhere, but it's something that I really didn't understand the psychological aspect behind change management. When you get under Cotter's steps of change management. Like, I mean, I think in staff college we probably had and it was probably pretty new around the time I went to staff college, his work in that space. So I mean, a lot of the stuff I've learned now, some of it wasn't even developed when I was in my 20s and 30s, right? Some of the leadership constructs that are out there now and formats. So I think change management was a big one. If I'd have known some more of that deeper theory, it really would have helped, I think, manage people's anxiety and stress and help them get through things. And I mean, that was a big one. And I think the other one is, like I said, leadership was probably learned for me mostly through watching others an example. And in hindsight, I think if I'd have just been a little more my authentic self at times, as opposed to having to be. So let me give you an example, and then I'll tell you the other story. So when I was a deputy commander of a fighter squadron, loved my CO. He's a great guy, but I think he was going through something for a small period of time, and I don't think he was showing up the way he would hoped he would show up, and so he was kind of the sort of good cop bad cop scenario. Mm-hmm. Kind of that leadership style at the top. He was kind of being a bad cop, so I kind of realized I had to be the good cop. Yeah. So when I took over the role, I went in as the everybody's buddy and the good cop, and not and probably overplayed it a little bit, that's probably more my authentic style anyways, just to be really personable and approachable. And so that really worked well for me. But he left, and a new guy came in, and he was the approachable, amazing, friendly, kind of guy. And so I felt like I had to be a little more the number two, the typical XO, hard nosed. So that switch in the middle when people are looking at me, they're like, "Are you schizophrenic?" And I don't think I probably should have. I think the pendulum probably swung a little farther than it needed to, in each direction. I probably should have just been a little more my authentic self in both scenarios.
You went from giving back rubs to kicking them in the ass.
I truly did. Not saying they didn't need it at times. Don't get me wrong, but again, I think the pendulum probably swung further than it needed. And I look back on that and I go, yeah, that probably wasn't well done. Right? Great lesson learned. So a little story. So I took over command of my unit, and we were an international flying training squadron, and they were understaffed, overworked. They've been flying weekends for months on end. Like they, probably of a month, they probably at least average 2 to 3 weekends of flying. So they were not getting any time off. And, it's typical. You go and you observe what's going on, what's happening, learn, assess. And I finally got to a point where when the guy's been flying weekends, and I finally said, although the weather forecast was good, on Thursday afternoon, I called my training officer in and I said, we're not flying this weekend. I just got the sense that exhaustion was setting in, and my people needed a break. Like it was a safety reason. Mission. You always say mission. They used to always say mission first. People always. Well, I need to do a little people first for a minute.
Yeah.
And so this goes back to what lessons did I learn going back, and it had to go. Stakeholder management is the other one. Mm-hmm. So this goes into stakeholder management. So managing up, managing down. So I had two bosses. The one on my care and feeding boss, the guy I reported to directly for my unit's well-being, was on the base where my unit was located. But for my program, it was a wing commander at a different base. Mm-hmm. And so the decision not to fly on the weekend fell under him. So what I failed to do was I made the decision, and then that was it. I didn't call anybody and tell them because he thought we were going to fly that weekend. Well, Friday morning, when he saw our schedule coming up for the weekend of no flying, I got a phone call, and he's like, "You're flying this weekend?" And I said, "No, we canceled yesterday." I said, "My team needs a break." He goes, "No, you don't. No, sorry." He goes, "That wasn't a question." I said, "You're flying this weekend." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Actually, no, I'm not." And he said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Sir," I said, "This is what I said to him." I said, "Sir," I explained what was going on. I said, "Sir, that's bad leadership, and I won't be part of it." Mm-hmm. And the phone went silent. And then he said, "We'll finish this conversation later." And he hung up. So I went home that night, and my wife at the time, my previous wife, and we hadn't finished unpacking all our boxes yet. I said, "Don't unpack any more boxes because I don't think but I would not have changed my mind. The decision I made was the right decision. How I went about it was definitely the wrong way to go about it. So stakeholder management is certainly one thing that I've learned that you need to do a little more digging into. It was probably that sort of, hey, this is my squadron and I own it and it's my responsibility and damn everybody else. But that was pretty naive at the time. But he never brought it up again, funny enough. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
Oh, I love that.
Well, and I had one of those moments also, where it's like, no, I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. And yeah, kind of the same conversation. The phone goes silent and says, except for mine, it was, be up here at the office in 15 minutes sort of thing. And,
yeah, he couldn't do that because he was like 300 miles away. So,
oh, man, you're lucky. You're lucky. It wasn't just lucky. Up the road.
No.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Mine, but mine ended the same way. It was, very much, I know this is the right thing to do for what we're doing and how we're doing it and who we're doing it with. Therefore, yeah, I got an ass chewing for doing it without getting permission. Mm-hmm. But that was all it was just an ass chewing. He felt better because he wanted to chew my ass for not telling him beforehand. But it was still the right thing.
Yeah, and in fairness to my boss and maybe to yours, if I'd have called him and told him what was going on and what I want, he probably would have supported me.
Yeah.
Right? He was probably more upset that I made this unilateral decision without consulting him. We've all been there, right? We've all had team members that have done that to us, and I think about that as well, and I go, yeah, I probably would have reacted the same way. So it was one small phone call, one little lesson in life, but I have taken a lot of lessons learned out of that one.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. And thanks for the great segue with the softball of lessons learned and what I learned today. And it's not really a learning, but it's that re-emphasis of it, of leadership as a life journey. It's a skill. That's what I love to tell and remind people. It's a skill that perishes if not used. And it's a skill that can always get better. It can always be refined. You can always do it just a little bit better and communicate a little bit better, create a better vision, influence people to do a little bit more in a different way. And how do you communicate? All these sort of things are skills that we should look at leadership as a path, a life journey path. Even if you're not in charge of somebody, if you're full on retired and just hanging back fishing every day, you're still leading yourself, and you still got to develop yourself and take care of yourself. So that's a great reminder and a lesson for me to think about. Camden, how about you? What'd you learn?
When we were talking about, debriefs and AAR, Waldo, you said, no name and rank inside the debrief, just call signs going through like that. And this is such an easy one. So for all of our rugby family that listens, Dad, apply that in your film sessions. Next time I'm doing a film session with my rugby team, it's not, hey, James, you screwed this up. Why'd you miss that tackle? It's like, look what 4 was doing here. Did you see how 4 dropped his shoulders before? And it's like, oh, I can see how that's such a little change, but it helps with the psychology a little bit. You're not calling them out in front of the other guys as much. They still know it. They still know what number they're wearing during the game. They can see it on the film, but it removes a little bit of that. I don't know, would almost feel like a personal attack is what comes to mind. I think it's a little bit extreme, but it removes any threat of that. And so they're going to be so much more receptive to it. So there's the lesson, and then the application for all of our rugby coaches out there who listen, because I know we got quite a few.
Awesome. Waldo, how about you, man? What'd you learn?
Interesting, and it's probably not going to be what you were expecting. I think just doing this with you today, Otis and Cam, was an incredible learning experience. If I look back now on when I transitioned, so this is what I've learned. I should have done find a mentor, find a friend, find somebody that you can sit down with and talk about your journey that will ask you hard questions or inquisitive questions, because we don't ask ourselves those questions. And this was really reflective for me to go through this exercise with you guys, just wanting to dig into my leadership journey a little bit. But I think it would have been really cool if I'd have done that maybe 10 or 12 years ago when I was retired. And probably would have had some greater observations that may have helped me as I moved into my transition to the private sector. I think this was really, really kind of, therapeutic in some ways, which I was not expecting. So thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah. I've had the same feeling when I transitioned out a number of years ago, and it's like, dang, how come these organizations that exist now didn't exist back then? And yeah, so but I also remind myself, if I hadn't walked that path, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. So Waldo, how do folks find you, see what you got, what you're going to do when the sabbatical is over?
Yeah, well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Rob Waldo Martin. You can connect with me anytime, and I'm always open to meeting new folks. And next time I'm here in Colorado Springs, so I'm always interested in meeting new people. I can meet for coffee and catch up and offer any insights of my personal journey. And if it can help somebody, I'm all in.
Awesome. Well, hey man, we really appreciate your time today and sharing with us, and opening it up with some great stories about the Canadian Royal Air Force.
All right. Well, thanks for the therapy session. It was free too. That's awesome. Much appreciated.
Who said this was free? The invoice will be in the mail.
It'll be coming later in the mail. All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank y'all for listening to the Cam and Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guests, Rob, Waldo, Marta, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass along to someone else so they can enjoy it too. Make sure to follow the Cam and Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch full views of the show on our YouTube page. And while you're there, make sure you hit that subscribe button too. As always, the full archive of our episodes available at www.camandotisshow.com. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next time.